I'd like to start off today. We're going to talk about a number of different things, and there's a method to the madness, and that's actually one of the reasons why we made one of the switches in the presentations this morning, because it's actually really important to understand the church's teachings on nutrition and hydration before we get into advanced directives, because nutrition and hydration is one of the big issues with advanced directives. So that's the reason for that switch. What I'd like to do and start out a bit is just give a brief overview of the National Catholic Bioethics Center, because I know a lot of people probably are not aware of it, but we do a lot of really good work. All right, so the National Catholic Bioethics Center. Who are we? What do we do? So to start, our mission statement, and as you can see up here, and by the way, I've got notes on everything, all right? I didn't make copies for everybody because I don't know how many people are going to be here. But on any of the presentations I'm doing, I've got written notes, so if you'd like them, just email me, right? And I'll be happy to send them to you, all right? So anyway, so the mission statement. The mission of the National Catholic Bioethics Center is to provide education, that's my job now, guidance and resources to the church and society to do what? Here's the key, and that's what we're going to be doing today. I hope, uphold the dignity of the human person in healthcare and biomedical research, thereby sharing in the ministry of Jesus Christ and his church, all right? Today's kind of overall theme is pro-life at the end of life, right? That's really what we are, all right? We're pro-life for the, upholding human dignity, upholding life from, as they say, womb to tomb, right? Today's the theme, as I said, is pro-life at the end of life. So this is what we do. Essentially what we are, and this is actually a slide that is working correctly, we're a think tank, right? That's what we do. My wife kind of laughs at me. She says, Joe, you realize you get paid to think. It's kind of scary if you knew me. My daughter says that. But we're founded in 1972. As you can see, we're located, I can say here, Broomall. If you're somewhere, if you're in California somewhere, people go, Broomall? It's like, well, outside of Philadelphia. And we have a staff of 20 people, including, as you can see, 6 full-time and 3 part-time ethicists. And these are our ethicists. I know you probably can't see them all too well, but our full-time ethicists are up at the top. You may recognize Father Tad Paholchik. He's very, very well known, EWTN and Relevant Radio and many others. But we also have 3 retired and or part-time ethicists. Some of you may know John Haas, very, very well known in the Philadelphia area, taught at St. Charles Borromeo Seminary. He went back to teaching at St. Charles Borromeo Seminary, seminary, not cemetery, after retiring from the NCBC. So that's our staff, right? And what do we do? What's our purpose? As you can see up here. Well, promote and safeguard human dignity from conception to natural death in the areas of biomedicine, in the areas of healthcare, right? That's what we seek to do. We are very, very strongly, we're very, very strong, let me rephrase that, our Catholic identity is very, very, very strong. We adhere to the teachings of the church, most particularly, and I'm going to reference this a number of times today, this document called the Ethical and Religious Directives for Catholic Healthcare Services. For those of you who don't know it, this is a document put out by the U.S. bishops, and it is essentially a guideline, a framework for moral decision-making in healthcare. You may have heard, you may not have heard, that next week the U.S. bishops are, whether they do it or not, or it's a step in the process, I don't know, they authorized themselves, I guess, back in their June meeting to update the ERDs to address gender ideology. And I know the parish addressed that in the past. And so there may be some changes to the ERDs, and we hope there are. But this is a document that I'm going to refer to. It's as I said, it's the guide for the delivery and provision of health care in the U.S. Our 3 primary activities, as you can see, are education, or well, take them in order, consultation, education, and publication. I just want to mention a few words about each one. A couple things about consultation. You might not know this about us, and this could be very helpful. We have a consultation service for individuals and also for institutions. Obviously, for you, it would be the individuals. We have an ethicist available around the clock. I'm not on duty today, so feel free to call the emergency line. But we have some available 24/7, 365. And we field about 1,500 consults per year from people. And as I'll mention in the next presentation coming up very quickly, about 40% of those consults are end of life. And we get consults from people all the time. Usually it's the person who's the healthcare power of attorney who has a question about, my loved one, this has happened. And the doctors are recommending removing a ventilator. Can we do that, right? We get that all the time, right? So it's a free service. And you can contact us either through our phone numbers you can see up there or through our website. And we, as I said, we do about 1,500 consults a year. During COVID, that went up to over 4,000, which was just nuts. It was just a funny story about that. It was just consult after consult about COVID-19 vaccines. I think my record is 30-something in one day. And in the middle of that, I got a phone call about removing a ventilator, and I was so happy. I was just like, I told the person, I'm like, thank you. But it was just nuts. But that's what we do. We also have institutional consults, which aren't, that's not going to be as relevant for you, but we work with Catholic hospital systems, we work with dioceses, on ethics and other things, as you can see up on the screen. Education. We do a lot of things with education, and actually the education program is very much evolving as we speak right now. So just so that you know, we have a biannual, which means that's not twice a year, it's every other year. I think I always get that messed up, which way that goes. But we have every other year workshop for bishops. So we invite all the US bishops, we invite bishops from Canada, the Caribbean, Central America, even now into South America. I think this coming February, we're going to have a cardinal from Ethiopia joining us as well. So what we do is we educate the bishops on cutting edge issues in healthcare. Apparently, our workshop is the second biggest gathering of bishops outside of USCCB meetings. So it's a wonderful resource. That's why the NCBC was really founded back in 1972. We have a certification program. It's our education program. We've got, out on our table over here, there's information about it. There's some folders or some pamphlets. Please feel free to take those. And if anybody's interested, you can talk to me about it. It's an academic year-long program in Catholic bioethics, and students who complete it, they can transfer credits to, we have 4 universities now? Yeah, 4 universities where you can transfer the credits to towards a master's degree. So we could talk more about that if anybody's interested. We have various seminars around the country. Ethos is available for presentations. And one of the things that we're starting to do is reach out to the high schools, right? Colleges and high schools. So we're actually starting a undergraduate Catholic healthcare ethics program. If anybody's in education, especially in Catholic high schools, we're starting an undergraduate healthcare ethics course that students can take for graduate credit, for college credit, not graduate credit, for undergraduate credit. And again, so we're working on that. So if anybody wants some more information, please feel free, we can talk about that. And then just the last thing on our publications. So we've got our quarterly, we've got our Ethics and Medics weekly, we've got a number of books, a couple of them are out on the table over here. But what we also have mostly for you today. And I ask you, I've got a number of copies of all of these, but I don't have copies for everybody. But they're available on our website. You can get them. We have a number of, if you see EOL, that means end of life, right? A number of end of life guides that we give to people that are actually, we hope are very, very helpful. So the first one is called A Catholic Guide to End of Life Decision Making. There's a copy of it out there. And in that document, we have our healthcare proxy form and our advanced medical directive form, right? And Jerry's going to be talking about that in our third presentation, but we have sample documents for people that you can use. We also have a guide to palliative care and hospice. We're going to be talking about that this afternoon. And part of that, there's an insert that we've actually got some really good feedback on. Questions to ask before enrolling a loved one in hospice, right? What are questions you should be asking hospice providers before, again, enrolling your mother, your father, brother, sister in hospice care? And that's the question. A lot of the questions are based on things we're going to talk about today. And then thirdly, a Catholic guide to POST, right? That's another, it's not an advanced directive, it's actually a medical order, but it functions in a similar way to an advanced directive. And we have a sample POST in there as well. I did see a question. Yes, POST the question is, what is POLST? POLST stands for Physician Orders for Life-Sustaining Treatment. And what it is, it's a document, it's a medical order, basically. And it's one of the things that's being pushed in terms of end-of-life care. Many people, if you go to a hospital, they'll throw, we get calls about this all the time. They put this form in front of me and they told me to fill it out and sign it, and I have no idea what it is. And I said, I bet it's a POLST. And they start reading it, and yes, it's a POLST. So it's a medical order that's meant to, it's meant to be a transferable medical order. In other words, you indicate you indicate to a physician what you would like done and not done. The physician fills it out, and it becomes a medical order that theoretically travels with you wherever you go. There are issues, we can talk about it a little bit when we get to the advanced directives, because some of our similar questions with the POLST we have with the living will, right? So, but that's essentially what it is, right? So that's going on. So for our first presentation today, as you can see, determining ordinary and extraordinary means of care. We do this one first because really, this question is really at the heart of probably most of the end-of-life consults that we do, and it's really going to be at the heart of a lot of things that we talk about today, right? Because we're always going to go back to, well, is it ordinary or is it extraordinary? Is providing nutrition and hydration ordinary and extraordinary? So to understand that, right, we're going to start with ordinary and extraordinary means, right? And this, again, this is very, very important in terms of healthcare. So I always like to start off these presentations by saying, why is this important? Like, why are you here today, right? Why is what we're presenting important for you to hear? And there's a couple of reasons. The first reason is, as you can see here, it's, in contrast to what our society tells us, we're going to die someday, right? Every one of us will, right? And because of that, we need to be able, or we need to be ready to address the various ethical and other challenges that come along with that. As I mentioned before, 40% of our consults, give or take, are end of life. So that's that's a pretty high percentage, right? And this is where people have questions. And by the way, we don't just get questions from lay people, we get priests, bishops call us up about questions. I wish I had $1 for every time I had a priest call up and say, hey, Joe, I know we learned about this in the seminary, but that was 30 years ago, and I've got this couple sitting here, and what do we do? All of us are going to die, but maybe even before that, many of us are going to be acting as the healthcare power of attorney, right? Otherwise known as the proxy or the surrogate. POA, by the way, stands for power of attorney. Right? You're going to be the proxy, surrogate decision maker, power of attorney for someone else. Most often it's a parent, and it's actually the surrogate who is the one who calls us. It's very rare on our consult line that we get a call from a patient, him or herself. It does happen, but it's actually pretty rare. It's usually from a power of attorney, right? A family member who has to make a decision, and they're like, help me to make a decision. All right? So in addition to each one of us dying, you're probably, and you may already, how many people actually right now are a power of attorney, or have been a power of attorney for someone? It's not a small number of people. Yeah, and this is for you. Right? Because it's one thing to make decisions for yourself, it's something else to make a decision for someone else. Yeah. A couple other reasons. And this is going to be an ongoing thing. 3 and 4 are kind of related. We can put both of them, we could put both of them up here. But as technological innovations continue, we're just going to have more ethical questions, right? We see this. 50 years ago, most of the end-of-life questions that we have wouldn't even be questions, right? Because the technology wasn't there to do it. Today, we've got nomothermic regional perfusion. Ooh, there's a mouthful. And that has huge implications for a number of things, including determining death, organ donation, all of these things. And that's just the latest example. We may hit on that a little bit this afternoon. But with technological innovations, the ethical questions really kind of go through the roof. And it really comes down to a question of, well, can we do it, but should we do it? Right? And again, we help people to address all of these things. And then finally, this is important because of the ongoing public policy, the legal debates, and I just have some of the things up here having to do with end of life. Certainly euthanasia and assisted suicide. There are those who are trying to bring those to across the country as a whole. POLST, as we mentioned before. MANH and VSCD. Anybody know what I'm talking about? I'll give $1 to the person who can tell me what I'm talking about. Good, I saved $1. My daughter can eat tonight. I saw George Asayu come in. George, you can't, wherever he is, you can't answer this question because he would know. But MANH is medically assisted nutrition and hydration. We're going to talk about that next. And VSCD is voluntary stopping of eating and drinking. Right? There are people who are pushing voluntary stopping of eating and drinking as essentially a legal option of suicide. Right? We'll talk about that. And certainly terminating brain death, which we'll talk about this afternoon. So there's a lot of issues that are going on. All right, so how do we figure all of this out? And what I always tell people in a consult is kind of talking about ordinary and extraordinary means in the abstract, which we're going to be doing here, is actually pretty easy. The difficult part is then applying it to real life. Right? So I think this distinction should be fairly easy to understand. But again, it's the difficulties are in the application. All right, so ordinary versus extraordinary. And what this is addressing is the question, or questions, as you can see up here. What do I have to do? What do I not have to do? Right? And again, think of this in terms of a proxy who has to make healthcare decisions for their 95-year-old mother or father with advanced dementia, something like that, right? So ordinary and extraordinary are going to help us to respond to these questions. All right, so what do we mean? What is an ordinary means of care from the church's perspective? What is an ordinary means of care? And there's really two questions or two things to address when you're talking about ordinary means of care. The first one is this: an ordinary means of care is one that offers a reasonable hope or a reasonable expectation of benefit for the patient. In other words, the intervention, the treatment is going to do, or there's a reasonable expectation that it's going to do what it's intended to do. So for example, kind of two ways of thinking about it, certainly not the only two ways, but two ways of thinking about it. One is an ordinary means of care. It's the normally prescribed means to return a body to a state of health, right? So if you have an infection, what's something that a doctor would do? Antibiotics, prescribe you antibiotics, right? The antibiotics, it's the normally prescribed means for, for treating that infection, right? Second, an ordinary means of care is one, and this is a little deeper, but it's a means of care that's going to assume some bodily function until the body can take over that on its own, right? A ventilator is an excellent example of that, all right? Sometimes, if there's an accident, there's a trauma, they're having trouble breathing, they're put on oxygen, maybe a BiPAP, but certainly a ventilator, is going to assume that bodily function until the patient can perform it on his or her own, right? So does the intervention that we're talking about, is there a reasonable expectation that it's going to bring benefit to the patient? It's going to do what it's intended to do. So that's one kind of criteria for an ordinary means of care. The second criteria is that its benefits outweigh its burdens, right? Medical interventions, there's benefits to them, but there can also be burdens to them, as you know. And so a second question that goes along with it in terms of determining ordinary means of care is, do the benefits of pursuing the intervention outweigh the burdens? Now, I'm going to give some examples of this in a few minutes, but we're just kind of setting things out here. All right? From the Catholic perspective, right, if a particular medical intervention meets these two criteria, then it is morally obligatory. Right? A patient has a moral obligation to accept this intervention. There's no option. Right? It's morally obligatory. And translating it into the proxy's perspective, if the proxy has to make a decision, if an intervention is ordinary, right, it's morally obligatory for the person for whom you are making decisions. Extraordinary means of care, it's essentially the exact opposite. right? An extraordinary means of care is one that offers no reasonable hope or expectation of benefit. So for example, and we've gotten this call, hey Joe, my name is Paul. So I've been through, this is my 4th time with X cancer, whatever it is. I've been through, 3 rounds of chemotherapy. The side effects are terrible. My doctors are saying that, if I do the chemotherapy, there's maybe a 50-50 chance that I may survive. Oops, I'm jumping ahead of myself here a little bit. Is there a moral obligation for me to accept this? And one of the criteria for that is, well, if that intervention doesn't offer a reasonable expectation of benefit, then it can be deemed extraordinary. Does that make sense? Make sense? Right? Another part of that, extraordinary, could be that the burdens of the intervention itself could outweigh any benefits. And we say, well, like, what does that look like? Here are some examples, or here are some factors that may, notice I put may indicate, because it doesn't necessarily, but we have to look at it within the context of this person's situation. What are some of the factors that may indicate that the burdens outweigh the benefits? Well, the treatment is experimental, right? So any experimental treatment, the church will say, that's going to be an extraordinary means of care, right? Or it could be deemed an extraordinary means of care. Bad side effects, as I mentioned, the person with chemo, we get that one fairly often. Dialysis, we'll get that as well too, side effects arising from that, right? If the side effects of the treatment outweigh any benefit that's going to come, indicates extraordinary. The intervention might interfere with the time, or interferes with the activities and the time that the patient has left. So for example, going back to Paul, the cancer patient, he may say, the doctor says that with chemotherapy I may last a year. Without chemotherapy I'll be dead in 5 months. But I've always really wanted to go to Rome. And the doctor said, for the first couple months I'll be relatively healthy. I really want to go to Rome, right? That's a factor that could indicate that the intervention has now become extraordinary. Poses severe demands on others. We've had situations where the demands on the family are just incredible, right? And those are factors that need to be factored in as well too. Cost as well, right? You don't want to make your primary decision about an ordinary and extraordinary means based on money, and you shouldn't, but that is a factor. And for many people, it's a very, very big factor. I mean, the question is, do I have a moral obligation to mortgage my house for the 3rd time and, and drain my retirement funds to, maintain, because Medicare or Medicaid's not paying for something anymore. These are real questions that people face, right? The treatment may be, or the intervention may be morally objectionable, and I just use ESC or ADCLs just because this was a big thing with the COVID-19 vaccines. ESCs, embryonic stem cells, although there are no therapies right now using embryonic stem cells, at least commercially available. But ADCLs, abortion-derived cell lines. This was a big issue during the COVID-19 pandemic, which probably a lot of you remember because all of the available COVID-19 vaccines here in the US were developed from or used abortion-derived cell lines in either their development or testing. And there are people who would say, I don't want any connection to that, right? And that could be a factor as well. And then just one last one, and I just love this one, that the intervention is psychologically repugnant. I just love that word, repugnant. Probably people here are thinking this presentation is repugnant, but that's okay. But think of a Jehovah's Witness, right? Jehovah's Witnesses will refuse blood products. It would be repugnant for them to be forced to be transfused with human blood. Some people will say, using organs from genetically engineered animals. There was actually a guy, the person who I believe got the 2nd pig heart. He just died, I think, this week or maybe last week. And there are people who would say, I don't want a pig heart in me. And that's okay, right? So these are factors that may indicate extraordinary means of care. And I kind of go through them because these are ones that people face, right? Maybe one, maybe more of those, all right? So an extraordinary means of care, as we saw up here, offers no reasonable hope or expectation of benefit. The burdens outweigh the benefit. The burdens of the intervention itself outweigh any benefits. We saw some of the factors. From the church's teaching, an extraordinary means of care is not morally obligatory. It's optional. You can pursue it if you choose, but there's no moral obligation to choose it, all right? Yes, no? Yes, no? I'm just making sure. Yes, no? All right. Here's kind of where it starts getting, this is where we have to start applying it. As I said, easy to understand conceptually, but sometimes it can get a little bit more difficult to apply practically. And some things to keep in mind, and these are some, it says important clarifications, some important misconceptions I think people may have. So the first thing that's really important to keep in mind when we're making decisions and we're trying to determine ordinary and extraordinary is to recognize that a particular intervention in and of itself is not ordinary or extraordinary. So for example, a ventilator in and of itself is not ordinary or extraordinary. Medically assisted nutrition and hydration, which we're going to talk about in the next presentation, a feeding tube essentially, is not ordinary or extraordinary in and of itself. We'll hear people say that all the time. You know, the doctor is saying, you know, my loved one, we should probably put her or him on a ventilator, and I know that's extraordinary. And it's like, well, no, not necessarily. What you have to do is look at the particular patient's situation, and I'm going to give you an example in a second, right? What the Catholic Church maintains is that it's the patient or the patient's proxy, the patient's POA, is the one who determines the ordinary or extraordinary nature of a particular intervention. It's not the healthcare team. You should consult with the healthcare team, absolutely, absolutely. You should consult with a priest, spiritual advisor, the NCBC if you so choose, for guidance, absolutely. But it's the determination of the patient or the patient's proxy as to what constitutes ordinary or extraordinary means. Let me give you an example. How are we doing? Just got about 10 minutes or so? Yeah. Dialysis, all right? So basic kidney dialysis, think of this. Two situations, and one of them is made up, the other one is real. This is the made up one, right? If I were to, I'm standing up here, it's November 11th, 2023. I'm standing up here at St. Peter's Parish, and all of a sudden I go, oh man, I don't feel very good. And I collapse. Boom, I go down. I used to do this in my undergraduate healthcare ethics class, and everybody go, 10-minute rule. Right. This was scary. I actually used this one time in a nursing class. These are nursing students. And I said, well, if this were to happen to me, at least you guys, you'd be able to treat me. And they go, oh, no, we can't touch you. I'm like, what? And they're like, no. If you collapse, we can call 911, but we can't touch you. I'm like, that was kind of scary. But anyway, let's say I collapse. You guys, I've got some medical professionals here, so hopefully, be able to take care of me. They take me to the hospital and they realize that I'm in renal failure, right? My kidneys aren't working. And they put me on dialysis. Or they're going to say, well, we want to put you on dialysis. Or they say to my wife or my decision maker. Is that ordinary or extraordinary means of care? Well, we got to look at the situation. I'm a 56-year-old guy, otherwise healthy, except for all of the, the back and the knee and, the aches and pains of getting older and all that other stuff. But I'm otherwise healthy, right? Otherwise healthy. We don't know why my, kidney stopped working, right? But they're going to do the dialysis to take over that function. Ordinary or extraordinary? Ordinary. Yeah, it's ordinary. Be an ordinary means of care, at least initially, right? Second situation, and this is a true one, right? So back on January 3rd of 2005, oh my goodness, wow. My grandmother died. She died 7 hours short of her 102nd birthday, all right? So she was 101 and 364 days and 18 hours or whatever it was when she died. My grandmother, up until about a week before she died, sharp as a tack up here. I mean, she was living in a nursing home. She had physical issues. Would go to visit her. My wife and I were living in Ohio at the time, and we would go visit her a couple times a year. You know, and that Christmas, it was right after the Christmas holidays when she kind of went downhill. But, I walked in the room and she goes, "Oh, Joey, good to see you. I see you're putting on weight." And I'm like, "Okay, yep, thank you." Sharp as a tack up here. All right? Don't laugh, it's true. And all the guys in this room, you've heard it. You've all heard it. But anyway, right after Christmas, she started declining. I mean, her body started shutting down. She was dying, right? She was 101 and she's almost 102 years old. About 3 or 4 days into that process, the nursing home called my mom, who was her proxy, her surrogate, her POA, and said, "Barbara, here's the deal. Your mother's kidneys have shut down, all right? We have a choice. We could either transfer her to the hospital and put her on dialysis, or we could not. What is it that you would like us to do?" Now, in this case, my mother made a decision. Dialysis, ordinary or extraordinary? Extraordinary. Yeah, extraordinary, right? Now, I don't know if my mother thought about this in this way, but with all of the various factors of my grandmother's situation, it was determined, rightly, that the dialysis would be an extraordinary means of care. I mean, for crying out loud, transporting to the hospital that probably would have killed her, to be honest with you. But, whatever. Point of all of this, it's the same intervention, right? Dialysis, it's the same intervention. They're doing it, for me or for my grandmother, they would have done the same thing. But for one of us, it was an ordinary means of care. For the other, it was an extraordinary means of care. And the point of this is to demonstrate that it's, you can see up here, the intervention itself is not ordinary or extraordinary. It's the intervention in that particular context. And that's what we have to figure out, right? That's what patients and really proxies are called to figure out, is in this particular situation, is it ordinary or is it extraordinary? And something else to keep in mind, under B2 up here, the intervention can begin as extraordinary, it can begin as ordinary and become extraordinary. Going back to me, right? I collapse here, I'm in the hospital, and they put me on dialysis. They could come to realize, as you do more testing and everything else, that I'm a lot more sick than I thought I was, right? And as the situation progresses or deteriorates, whichever way you want to put it, it's entirely possible that what started out as ordinary could become extraordinary. That happens, right? That happens. A practical example of that is a ventilator. Someone will be put on a ventilator to, we don't know exactly what's going on, but then when it's determined that this person is going to be ventilator dependent for the rest of their life, then it could transition into extraordinary, right? So the point of all of this, again, is just to say, don't think a particular intervention being ordinary or extraordinary in itself. You have to always look at it in the context. And that's going to be a theme for the day. You always have to look in the particular context. John Paul II, in his, what I'm saying is very clearly established in church teaching. John Paul II in Evangelium Vitae from 1995, the Gospel of Life. Right? Now he's speaking about it in terms of euthanasia, right? But this is, here's what he says. Euthanasia must be distinguished from the decision to forego so-called aggressive medical treatment. In other words, medical procedures that no longer correspond to the real situation of the patient, either because they are now disproportionate, extraordinary, to the expected results, or because they impose an excessive burden on the patient and his family. By the way, if something's underlined up there, it's going to be on the test. So just so you know. All right? And he goes on to say, in such situations when death is clearly imminent and inevitable, one can, in conscience, refuse forms of treatment that would only secure a precarious and burdensome prolongation of life, so long as the normal care due to the sick person in similar cases is not interrupted. Translation, You can forego extraordinary means of care as long as you maintain ordinary means of care. Right? That's what John Paul II is talking about. The ethical and religious directives. As I mentioned before, this is a document from the U.S. bishops. It's available online. You can just Google, actually, no, don't Google, DuckDuckGo, the ethical and religious directives, and they will come right up. Directive 56 says this, and we'll just do 56 and 57, and we'll end it there. Directive 56, a person has a moral obligation, right? A moral obligation, a patient, proxy, whomever, has a moral obligation to use ordinary or proportionate means of preserving his or her life. Proportionate means are those that, in the judgment of who? The patient. Not the medical team, not some academic in some ivory tower somewhere far away. No, in the judgment of the patient, offer a reasonable hope of benefit and do not entail an excessive burden or impose excessive expense on the family or community. And then the corollary to that is Directive 57. A person may forego extraordinary or disproportionate means of preserving life. Disproportionate means are those that, in the patient's judgment, again, the patient's judgment, do not offer reasonable hope of benefit or entail an excessive burden or impose excessive expense on the family or community. All right? So this is the foundation, all right? This really is the foundation for end-of-life decision-making because, as I said, you know, I don't know what the actual number is, but probably 75, 80% of the end-of-life consults that we get, this plays into it very much, right? Is a particular intervention, and this is across the spectrum of life, but particularly at the end of life, is this particular intervention, the ventilator, this medication, this operation, whatever it may be, is it ordinary or is it extraordinary? If it's ordinary, then we have a moral obligation to pursue it. If it's extraordinary, it's morally optional, right? So kind of keep this in mind as we go through the rest of the day. This is going to come back in the next presentation, and it's going to come back again and again today. All right? Yeah, so that's my contact information right there. Please feel free to email if you'd like any of the notes. If you can't read it, it's just J-Z-A-L-O-T, all one word, J-Z-A-L-O-T at NCB Center, CENTER.org. Right? And for those, yeah, this is kind of small screens here, but the phone number is, my direct line is 215-871-2014. So, yeah, so please feel free, if you like any of the notes or any of the guides, please feel free to just send me an email.